Okay, I got it. No problem.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Greetings from the Indian Occupational Therapist think tank. So this is our 12th Saturday night chat session, and we started this initiative a couple of years ago. And the basic premise behind this initiative is everything starts with a discussion. So in each session, we chose a topic and we invite the like-minded peoples to come and discuss that issue so that we can identify some patterns, trends, glean some information out of the discussion, and then also identify some next steps. All of our past Saturday night chat sessions are available on our YouTube channel, and now today is our 12th Saturday night chat session, and this is a special one. Because we have a great person joining us today to guide us through the discussion. So IOTTT is proud and glad to have Emeritus Professor Dr. Gail Elizabeth Whiteford for our Saturday night chat today. Dr. Whiteford is a pioneer in the fields of occupational therapy and occupational science for more than 3 decades. She is a well-renowned author and scholar. Her research has been cited more than 1,880 times. She has served in clinical, managerial, research, and consulting roles, including for the Department of Foreign Affairs in Australia. Her contribution to the profession has been recognized through awards from international bodies, including the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists, the Moroccan Association of Occupational Therapy Association, and Occupational Therapy Australia. She has given keynote addresses in 13 countries, including the prestigious Zemke Lecture in the United States in 2022. She was made an inaugural fellow of the Australian Occupational Therapy Research Academy in 2017 and has an extensive publication track record. Professionally, Dr. Whiteford has held a number of senior academic, executive, and conjoint appointments in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and served as Australia's first Pro-Vice Chancellor of Social Inclusion at Macquarie University. In 2023, she was awarded the Order of Australia for significant service to tertiary education and to community health. The Order of Australia recognizes Australians who have demonstrated outstanding service or exceptional achievement. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Whiteford. Please guide us through the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome and introduction, even though it's kind of long at this stage. So I really appreciate that. And it's really a delight for me to be here and an honor. And I'm really looking forward to the time when we get to throw open the discussion about some really important issues. I would like to start this evening for me here in Australia, though, with an acknowledgement of country. And that's where I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on tonight, which is the tribal Biripi group, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd like to extend that acknowledgement to any Indigenous people that we might have joining us tonight. The reason that we do a acknowledgement of country in Australia is to remind ourselves of our colonial history and the past, and remind ourselves that the lands that we're on were never ceded or sold, and there was no treaty for them. And it's an important reminder of where we're at in our history, and of course of all the injustices that occurred for our Aboriginal people. And many of them are, of course, occupational injustices. And that's probably a segue into our discussion this evening. What I really want to do tonight is not talk about stuff that you can read so much, but pull together a bit of a synthesis of some key ideas and then provide an opportunity for all of us collectively to really discuss them and have a go at them. So I want to start, of course, with thinking about occupation as a human right. There's a bit of a discussion in the literature about, is it justice or is it rights? Let's talk about that first. I then want to talk about the 4 pillars of occupational therapy that seem really fundamental, but I also am so aware that people have lost sight of them in some of the practices that we see in different parts of the world. I want to look at why we would focus on occupation, the relationship to social inclusion. Of course, having social inclusion in my title for a while really foregrounded the importance of staying clear about the importance of social inclusion to so many of the groups that we work with. I want to talk about justice and injustice and why being excluded is so negative and the impacts of that, particularly over time. And then finally, I want to get to some ideas that take us beyond these more conceptual considerations to how you might actually advance occupational justice. And I have really high hopes for the think tank in India, and I really see a potential leadership role for Indian occupational therapists. And I really hope we can discuss what that might look like. So let's forge on. I just want to point you to this reading because at the moment, again, rather than talk about stuff you can read, I would say this is perhaps the best, most comprehensive treatment of occupational justice with a lot of case examples and narrative data from research included in it. So this is where I'm probably being a little what's the word I want here, assertive to say this is the most comprehensive review of occupational justice. But right now it probably is, because we had the opportunity in a book chapter to have a lot of word limit and really go into depth. So that's Understanding and Advancing Occupational Justice and Social Inclusion, and it's in the Handbook of Social Inclusion. Now, if you were to tell me that you had trouble getting hold of this or that was difficult to source, I know that can be the case. Someone can just let me know and I might have to be able to send a copy of that through. But we should try and always, use proper sources. But if that's hard to get hold of, I'll be really happy to share that, knowing that that's the case. So the readings there, I'd really point you to that to unpack some of the stuff I'm going to go through pretty quickly tonight. I want to take us back to where our peak body internationally is. And I think, I don't know about you guys, but I was really delighted when WFOT decided to translate some of the articles of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights to what this meant for us in occupational therapy and in occupational science as well. So you may be very familiar with these. So I'm just going to really speak to some of the ones that I think are particularly salient. First of all, that people have the right to participate in a range of occupations, but particularly in a way that's consistent with culture and beliefs. That people have a right to be supported in those choices. And I think this third point here, really importantly, that people have the right to choose for themselves, to be free of pressure, to be free of being forced or coerced, and to participate in occupations that may threaten safety, survival, and those occupations that are dehumanizing, degrading, or illegal. So this brings to our attention that this goes on, as you all well know, and brings it to the foreground for us. So the right to occupation encompasses people participating in a civic way, and I'm hoping that we might talk about that later. I think it's an underdeveloped area of our work in communities, productive, social, and creative, as well as spiritual and restorative occupations. And the really growth area in terms of the awareness and the profession over the last couple of decades is that looks different in different contexts, and so it should be. Although the principles of occupational therapy are universal, and you should be able to see what occupational therapy is by the principles underpinning how it's being done, the form of it will look different in different places and should look different in different contexts. So in terms of society as a whole, the human right to occupation is underpinned by the valuing of each person's diverse contribution. And that's regardless of difference, regardless of their status, but their identity individually and collectively is upheld. And finally, that the focus here is that abuses of the right to occupation may take the form of economic, social, physical exclusion. But there's also, as you well know, attitudinal, physical barriers, and also through control of access to necessary knowledge, skills, resources, or venues in which people would normally be participating in occupations. So this is Your Peak Body, IOTTT, has created these articles consultatively, and I think that they're a really good touchstone for us as we go forward into our deliberations and what it means in each country and each context. So what's the mandate? I think this simple table took me about 20 years to distill, along with my colleague, Professor Elizabeth Townsend. So it's a good reminder of the what, how, why, and where. What's our core knowledge? Obviously, it's occupation, and we need to remind ourselves that that's our domain of concern. That's where we have a corpus of knowledge, and no one else does. And so we have to be as strong as we can in naming that and being solid in representing that. Occupation's everyday life. The how of occupational therapy practice is, of course, always collaborative, always enabling, whether it's with a family, individual, community, or increasingly perhaps at a population level. And that's to empower people. I know it's a word that's used a lot. That's what we're always aiming to do. And if you don't see that, you don't see an essentially collaborative dynamic, it's not occupational therapy to me. Why? Interestingly, I don't think we discussed why for a very long time, and now it's being interrogated pretty thoroughly, which is great. It's, of course, about social change and social transformation and reducing the kind of injustices that you see every day once you start seeing the world through occupational lenses. And always then about ensuring that people have their right to be included in society upheld and promoted. So social inclusion is really important. It's really important that we keep that focus as the why. And finally, where, what I usually say to students is that occupational therapists are wherever people are, and because wherever people are, occupation is fundamental. So whether it's it could be a policy arm of government, it could be a school, it could be a police station, it could be a community, it could be, I can see Caitlin there, Caitlin working in the desert with Aboriginal communities. Occupational therapists are where people are engaging naturalistically in their occupations. But what should be at the foreground for us is that we're working towards the relevance of that interaction for the people in the place where they are. It's got to be relevant to what they want, to what they need, and to their identities. And I've got a slide quite a bit later on where we're really going to pull that together because it's such an important point. I reckon this is probably pretty stuff that you're aware of, but social inclusion is about ensuring that people have the resources that they need, they have the opportunities and capabilities. I know some of you are familiar with the work of Amartya Sen, capabilities approach, to learn, to work. And of course, work is not just paid employment. It might be voluntary work, including family and care responsibilities. The latest costing in Australia is that unpaid carer work in Australia is worth $7 billion annually. So it's a big one. To engage, connecting with other people, using services, participating in local cultural, civic, and recreational activities. But importantly, is also that people are able to have a voice and influence decisions that affect them directly. And again, we know that historically for disadvantaged and marginalized groups, it hasn't been the case, but this is a really important arena for us going forward into the future. So how does that all happen? What ties all this together? The social inclusion discourse is about these pillars of learning, working, engaging, having voice. But the way I see it is that this always happens through occupational participation, which of course is a mandate for us to have a really important role in society. I've always seen it that way. Okay, occupational justice, again, you're probably already pretty familiar with the background here and you can read more, but Anne Wilcock, who was my doctoral supervisor, and we spent many years talking and writing about this stuff in great detail. And I'd have to say I miss her since she passed, and Liz Townsend. But I would really go out on a bit of a limb here and say that wasn't new in occupational therapy per se. I think it's a revisiting of the very early roots of occupational therapy, where occupational therapists were working. This is prior to World War I, when we kind of got involved in certainly the delivery of medical and rehabilitation services to injured soldiers. That before that, occupational therapists were around in their early form in the Industrial Revolution, working with people who'd been marginalized through the Industrial Revolution, and the arts and crafts movement, which was about the dignity of production, artisan production, and ensuring that people were participating in society rather than being marginalized into the poorhouses and slipping through in terms of what was going on in society at the time. So really it's going back to earlier roots rather than a new development per se. I would like to make this point is that having been very close to Anne Wilcock, she was also very influenced by Marxist ideology, which is a whole other discussion. Usually scares people a lot, but she was. Okay, so the concept of occupational injustice is so powerful because once we think about society in this way, it makes visible those situations in which the opportunities of people, of communities to participate and engage are infringed and delimited and excluded and oppressed. You may be familiar with this table. There's a new one at the bottom there. So early on, there was an attempt to describe the types of injustices that we might be able to identify and see in society, and some of the people who really worked to develop those notions. Alienation, apartheid, which of course has its own controversial history, imbalance, marginalization, deprivation, which has been an enduring interest and concern of mine probably for 30 years now. And more recently, with a group in Chile, we're trying to develop the notion of occupational displacement, which is, I think, a really important form that's probably occurring around the world, where people are removed forcibly from traditional spaces, territories that ultimately result in diminished opportunities for them to engage in meaningful opportunities and occupations of necessity. In the work I've been doing with my colleagues in Chile, it was about the Mapuche, the indigenous people, being forcibly removed from any territory that looked like the government wanted to develop it or turn it into a resort. A very high profile example has been of people in Cambodia who work in waste areas and waste dumps that, unpleasant though that may be, has been a way they're able to make a living and survive and participate. Again, being relocated because that land was wanted for commercial development. So that's a high profile one if you want to Google that one. So quick overview of some of the forms of injustices that have been named. some thoughts here about how do we advance occupational justice and work for more inclusive societies. First of all, let's be clear about the principles that underpin our work and the principles that we serve. And I'm also a fan of Chomsky there. He talks about getting the principles right, being clear about the principles, and the operations will follow. We need to then act in ways that are consistent with those principles and values, using, I think, models and frameworks that centralize occupational justice. POJF, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that soon. Core approach, Pereira. So those frameworks that use language in a consistent way. And when we do this, we're tackling hegemony. Hegemony is really kind of a big one to unpack here, but it's hegemonic practices where we inadvertently practice in ways that reproduce systems of disadvantage and power imbalances. I really don't have time to talk too much more about it here, but it means that our role gets expanded into a more politicized form of activity, including advocacy, lobbying, and actually being activists per se. And it's a really bit of discomfort for occupational therapists there because it's a very different way of thinking about what they do. But we can talk about that. We need to represent our unique perspective and our value system in the service of societal transformation. So our influence should be at different levels, but certainly to influence discourses and policy and to help bring about policy reform. We need to engage politically consistently. Position statements in this country have been really, once we got clear in Australia and Occupational Therapy Australia about our principles and what we're focused on, we've developed a raft of position statements, and this has helped us apply those positions and stand for them consistently. For example, with Occupational Therapy Australia, I led a team and we developed a position statement on occupational deprivation that's now been used more than 28 times in Senate inquiries and government hearings, and everything from homelessness to treatment of asylum seekers to provision of accommodation for young people with acquired brain injury. So that's what we take then to speak to this issue and represent occupation as our core concern and demonstrate that we're about the advancement of occupational justice. One of the senators in our country said at one of these hearings, this notion of occupational deprivation is so important, and I can't believe I haven't seen this before. So we all kind of cheered in the background over that one. So you can politicize your effort in a consistent way, but I'd have to say that position statements really helped us to do that here. Participatory occupational justice background. Basically, Liz Townsend and I shared a sense of unrest about many aspects of occupational therapy practices. We saw it being delivered and the way it was being described, but also importantly, that there wasn't an appropriate model for occupational therapy practice in communities. So we decided that we could create something a little different that could be the basis of practice in a different way, always centered in occupation, enablement, and justice. We wanted it to be something that wasn't prescriptive. We didn't want to tell occupational therapists what to do. Some models are very good at telling you what to do exactly at each step and what tools to use and what comes next. And in some settings, that's probably okay and appropriate. But when you're in a community setting, it's not. It just doesn't really work that way. And I don't know that that's particularly empowering for people, because the power dynamic is still largely one in which the professional person, occupational therapist, holds the power in terms of directing action. So we wanted something that was not linear, and it wasn't going to tell people what to do, and that it wasn't focused on or oriented towards pathology. The focus wasn't a clinical one. We didn't want assessment tools. We didn't want it to be instrumental, but rather driven by process, and something that was essentially power sharing. So being and doing with, but putting the people that you're working with in the driving seat. And ultimately that means that the locus of control is being handed over as well. And again, this is probably not everybody's cup of tea in terms of a way of working, but it's the way it should be. Pretty simple diagram, but it's an attempt to remind us that even though you might be working with a group of people, a community, a family, actually at any moment there's so many layers of influence bearing down on that interaction. So from very outer layer we know that things like the global context where there are national borders, conflict zones, trade partners, strategic alliances, big issue for us in Australia at the moment, are influencing what's going on at the next level, which is the national, political, legislative, policy, sociocultural, and economic context. So here we might think about what are the legal frameworks that we're working within? What are the human rights observances within this particular national context? And we know that all countries are not created equal when it comes to observing human rights. What are the cultural, gender, religious, secular considerations, and what kind of resources are available? It's all influencing what you're doing at any moment, whether or not you're thinking about it. And at a local level, of course, there is actual physical environment, including safety, security, access to technology, and things like the human and non-human resources to hand. So it's all happening in a dynamic mix, but you'd be kidding yourself to think that all these layers of contextual factors are not influencing what you're doing at any moment, because they are. We said it was nonlinear. It's not. You can start anywhere here, and sometimes when you are invited into community, you could come in at any point, whether to help find resources or to advocate or to develop a plan. One really important part of the process to circle back to, because it's so important, is to name and raise consciousness of the situation as an occupational injustice. So, for example, even in my community locally, there wasn't a playground that children could go to who had any range of particular needs. So families of children with disabilities didn't have a play space. And, that was impacting on their lives, on the children's lives, on their development. So naming that as not just a problem of equipment availability is actually an occupational injustice, that our community wasn't providing a space, a civic space for children with a range of needs to engage in the most important occupation for children, which is play. So to bring that awareness to a group of people and help them to name and understand it as such really changes things, and it changes mindsets, and it engages people in a different way, and also really locates the issue as an extra personal issue. So it's not that there's something wrong with me or us, it's something wrong happening out there, whether it's local political level, state, national, that we can then move to address together to create change. It's can be very, very powerful. So I won't go through all of those, but needless to say, at the end of some interaction, either things could come to a close. So in our community here, the playground got built, after input to, and a lot of time negotiating with local council, local government, and there was some input from some an NGO here, and also the private sector. And there's a beautiful playground now where children of all abilities can come and play. And most recently, they've added a water play feature there. It's just fabulous. So that has closed. But there are times when, in fact, it's just the beginning of a process. So there's a need to advocate for that to be sustainable. And of course, sustainability then circles back to finding more resources from different sources. So it gives you an idea. You can ask me more questions about it. Underpinning the POGF is a series of articles, and there's actually 8. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just want to pick out one to give you an idea of the larger mandate that you're signing up to when you're working within the participatory occupational justice framework. And that's that occupational therapists strive to work with others in the pursuit of the ideal occupational justice, irrespective, and that's a really important word there, of attendant political and economic challenges and current environmental limitations. Hope, such an important word, and a vision of possibility always underpins their efforts. I'm going to leave you with that to think about. So, just picking up some key thoughts here. Occupation's fundamental to our existence. It's an organising force for people individually and collectively. We're experts in occupational doing. Often when I'm interacting with people who don't share our professional background or the media, over time I've got to spend time in print, radio and TV. I say we're experts in doing. And we can talk some more about that. When we represent this as our domain of concern and voice that, we actually have more power to influence for change and also to advance occupational justice, and people get doing. A social inclusive society is one in which people are able to participate fully through doing, not just theoretically, but through actually doing, whatever their age, gender, ability level, cultural, ethnic, religious, or sexual orientation. Fully included. So the POGF, and I haven't talked about the core approach here, limited time, but I do also recommend that to you in terms of reading. These 2 approaches are really grounded in a concern for justice. They're tools which provide a process for working collaboratively with people in power sharing, sustainable ways for social transformation, nothing less, and creating a more occupationally just world. Okay, so this is where I've got to now. I think that just focusing on occupational justice itself is inadequate in the era that we're in. So Occupational Justice Plus, I named a couple of years ago. It's been a little slow to catch on. But what I'm trying to do here is say, actually, you know what? We need to focus on occupational justice, which is ways of and opportunities for doing with ways of knowing. We might call that epistemic justice, with ways of being represented, understood, which is hermeneutic justice. Together, this is where real change can happen. But you have to be cognizant of these 3 arms together in working with people. Any less than that, and I think we're at risk of reproducing some of those discourses, dominant discourses and power imbalances of the past, including, of course, colonisation. And the reference for that is there below as well. And I want to leave you with a couple of final ideas here. So these, just before COVID, I was in Palestine, and there with some fabulous occupational therapy students of all faith backgrounds, actually. And they taught me a lot about the occupational deprivation that they live with on a daily basis. On the left, Banksy has been very active in Palestine, and his work is all over the place, and that actually means a lot to people. The latest from them, I had another email yesterday from my colleague there, and of course they're having a hard time. But despite the fact that there's only one road and one checkpoint open where they live in Palestine, which is not in Gaza, but it takes them 3 hours to get to university, to get through the checkpoint, and 3 hours to get home. They still come to university every day because it's so important to them, and that's the ability to go to university and be doing their occupational therapy degree is so important that they, face that 6 hours a day. So, I learned a lot from them, and probably I'd like to dedicate tonight's presentation to them. They're just wonderful. But final thought, of course. Now, I know it's not Gandhi Jayanti till October, but I think this is a really good way to pull all this together. And of course, and that's from Gandhi himself, saying that you never actually know what the results are that might come of your actions. But if you do nothing, there'll be no results. Okay, I'm going to finish there and throw it open to some discussion. And here's an idea. No comment, no question is wrong or misguided. So anything that you want to say is absolutely on the table. So let's go from there.
Thank you, Dr. Whiteford. That was a very thought-provoking sort of a background that you've set the context for the discussion. Now it was very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you so much. So now, participants, if you have any questions or any ideas or thoughts that occurred to you as we heard Dr. Whiteford, please go ahead. So just to break the silence, I will just get started with.
It's how it always is.
So,
hi, sir. This is Sukumar here, occupational therapist from Tamil Nadu.
Go ahead, Sukumar.
Yeah, thank you very much for arranging such a wonderful seminar. This is the first time I'm hearing completely about occupations and occupational justice and occupational justice and injustice to occupation. So today only I learned how an occupational therapist can influence the community with this framework. And thank you very much for Whiteford, madam. And in India scenario, there is so much of diversity. Like you said about Aboriginal community, we have so many diversity of population living in India. We have so much of challenges, and we haven't started to work on it. So this might be a good opportunity. We have learned about this frame of work, and we will definitely implement this, and we will find ways to help people to get their occupational justice. And thank you so much, ma'am. And actually, this is a new framework. First time you are hearing it, so we don't know where to start and where to end. So we'll definitely keep in touch.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear. I'm also happy to, again, within appropriate bounds, share some of the resources of the POJF. So if someone wants to follow up with me afterwards, I can send some more stuff through for distribution through the networks. Very happy to do that. But thank you for that feedback.
So any other questions or comments that someone wants to make? All right. So Dr. Whiteford. So with this talk, I see that you're challenging the clinicians to become activists in a way. Am I right? So that's a big transition there, and obviously it requires a lot of skill set. So in order to transition from a clinician to an activist. So from that perspective, so what are your thoughts in terms of what should occupational therapists that they like, what skill set that they need to develop in order to effectively advocate for occupational justice in their local community or context?
Well, I don't know that it's such a different skill set. It probably seems like it, but I reckon the first step is thinking about things causally this way. And the first step is to see the world through these occupational lenses, and also the lens of occupational justice and injustices. And once you do that, you can't unsee it. You can't unthink the world this way. And use language appropriately too. So if you think about the way that occupational therapists slip into medical terminology, for example, very quickly, well, you know what, I don't really think that's particularly useful for us when you think about the kinds of people we might be working with. Some of the most very disadvantaged and vulnerable people, really a diagnosis that might be attached to them is not really the biggest issue for them. And if we're not the ones that are addressing their occupational needs and the fact that they're encountering such big injustices, well, who the heck's going to do that? And so being an activist sounds scary, in that people imagine they're going to be, marching onto Indian Parliament and carrying placards, and it's not that at all. Might be that, but it's really about the representation of this perspective in whatever forum you're in. If you're in a hospital, or if you're in a clinic, if you're in a community centre, actually to bring attention to these issues and to name them as such. So again, you're depathologizing often medicalized settings by focusing on the way that the environment, including discourses which marginalize people through the use of language, including diagnostic terminology, to stop doing that and really be very conscious of being focused on occupation and how people are being excluded from participating. And in institutions, I've got to actually make a point here about institutions. I think institutions are where we're able to do some of our very best work. I know it doesn't seem like community in a way, but it is a discrete community. I've been to some institutions in different parts of Southeast Asia and actually in Europe that would make you weep, probably made me weep. Children tied up, actually, and people locked in rooms, people held in vast numbers, with no resources and nothing going on. So whether it's orphanages or group homes, institutions for people who have mental illness. So these are places where often it's not very visible what's going on, or not going on is often a little invisible. And we have an ability to do some of the most important work in institutions, advocating for the rights of people to engage in occupations of meaning, and to work against, in particular, the occupational deprivation that's so pervasive in so many institutions. And if people are interested, there's a British Journal article that I wrote with colleagues based on how we're advancing occupational justice in a forensic mental health hospital, where people were often kept in secure spaces and in detention with nothing and in complete isolation, which actually makes them worse anyway. So I think being an activist takes many forms, but certainly naming, framing, raising awareness, educating others, using language and speaking out is part of it. You've got to, I'm not afraid to speak out anymore. It's got me into a fair bit of trouble and different places. And, but it doesn't, if you take that on board as a responsibility, knowing that you're working for social change, it takes you a long way. Maybe it's part of getting older. I don't know. I don't worry about saying the wrong thing or saying what I believe or standing up for things, because I've empowered myself as I've got older as a woman too. But you got to trust me that the more you do it, and if you decide collectively that you're going to go down this pathway, you'll find solidarity in doing that, and you'll find solidarity with the people that you're working with.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. And definitely there are some key takeaways here. Again, you need to see the world from the occupational lens. And obviously, when you say you need to speak, you need to educate, then we need to first have that clarity and also the skill to effectively communicate. So anyway, yeah, thank you. That was very insightful answer again. So I see Suresh's hand. I do have another question, but let Suresh go first, and I will come back. Suresh.
Over to Suresh.
Suresh, would you like to ask a question? Suresh, can you hear me? Suresh Kumar? Yeah. Suresh, we couldn't hear you.
It's on mute.
It's unmuted, but still we couldn't hear you.
Yeah. Shame. He looked very passionate about what he was saying.
Yeah, true. So I see Preeti's hand. Miss Preeti, would you like to go?
Yes, sure. So hello, and thank you for this, this topic, because I have always wanted to connect social justice with occupational therapy, because my background, my grandfather is a social activist, and I always tend to wonder how to connect our occupational therapy principles with social justice issues. Even recently, I have thought to start a support group for caste-based trauma survivors. So actually, this framework, what was shared in this presentation, really serves as a foundation, if at all I begin that support group. And thank you for your presentation.
You're very welcome. In the reference that I gave at the beginning, what I've done is pull together a comparison of different types of justice, including distributive justice, restorative justice, social justice, and occupational justice. And I think one of the key differences, and not everybody has quite got this, is that yes, we would all really hope to advance social justice and focus on social justice, but the slight difference there is that whilst to some extent social justice focuses on sameness, so ensuring that people have the same access to resources, that they have the same resources, that they have the same opportunities and accesses to opportunities. Occupational justice says let's focus on the difference. So sameness in terms of equity of access, but acknowledging that people have different occupational needs and are in different contexts. So let's focus on that difference. So in Australia, there's a scheme, for example, where people can get prescribed wheelchairs. So it used to be that everyone had the same, so it's a social justice approach. Everyone got a wheelchair. But you know what? If you're a farmer and a farm here in remote Australia, you need a different kind of chair, right? If you're an 8-year-old, you're going to need a different chair. So let's look at the person, the community, the context, and their occupational needs and what's different, and address that difference to really fully enable and support that person to participate occupationally in society. So if you can get hold of that chapter, if not, like I said, I'm happy to send that through. It just helps clarify, the differences between those different justices, but most importantly, the two that get conflated is social justice and occupational justice, and just, put it in the context of the broader reading around that stuff and some of those key concepts. But good to hear that you've got that family activist background. You must be proud of them.
Suresh has also typed out his question. Can I just read that one out?
Go ahead,
Sure.
go ahead, Caitlin.
So Suresh has written, given the current OT context in India, where practitioners are too much into clinical aspects of addressing impairments, what could be the strategy to introduce the aspects of occupational justice in practice? What has been your experience working with students and practitioners in LMICs?
Sure. I'm going to go back, Suresh, to what I was saying earlier, that starting with the naming and describing and using language differently is a really important starting point. So with this group in the forensic mental health hospital, a very clinical setting, they called me and they said, we've lost our way. Nothing we do here is occupational at all anymore, and we have no job satisfaction. So I said to them, well, let's perhaps look at how you're talking about what you're doing and what you're actually doing. None of it was occupational therapy at all. It was anger management groups or blada sensory groups. I don't know. Anyway, so, and they didn't describe anything in terms of the occupations that they were providing or not providing for the patients in that forensic mental health hospital. So just starting by talking about occupation and then writing in their notes that they were using occupation, and that then got traction with other staff. One of the psychiatrists said, I've never seen such good reports when they started talking about occupation and focusing on that. So I would say that's a kind of simple starting point, is to change the culture by changing language, and then you change expectations, and then you create an environment in which people are talking about the importance of engaging in occupations of meaning for health, well-being, for social connectedness. And then the ripple effect tends to go out from there. That whole setting now in Sydney, Australia, has transformed itself. And you have psychiatrists saying, oh, this person, you know, they're a prime candidate for occupational therapy because that's the way they're going to get back to the community through meaningful occupation. You know, so it's a remarkable ripple effect if you take that first step of centralizing it. So here I would recommend the work of Anne Fisher on the way she describes occupation-centered versus occupation-focused work and what the difference is. So terminology counts, but just start doing it. Make it a challenge to talk about occupation and what the injustices are that people that you're working with might be facing, more than the language, which is often, you know, their upper limb rehab, or the, you know, the fact that they're going to need more wrist extension, whatever. Let's get, that's the language and nomenclature and discourse of medicine. It's not ours. We are about whole people, whole groups of people, whole communities. We're not about single digits. We're not about atomized parts. We never should be. And when we're focused there, we're really preventing those people or denying them an opportunity to really have that bridge to re-engaging their life or engaging their life in an occupational way. I think it's a moral and ethical issue, because if we're not doing occupation, who the heck is? You can see I get very passionate about this.
All right. Shobha ma'am, would you like to go next?
Yeah, Gail, first of all, thank you so much for doing this presentation. It's very, very informative, and it's very connecting, you know, people like us who've been looking for the right resources in order to engage occupational justice concept within the work practice, you know. So my question to you is basically, you know, as a person, as a senior member or in occupational science, what would be your recommendation for introducing the concept of occupational justice in bachelor degree curriculum in India, and how is it in Australia?
Okay. Well, I don't think there'd be any course in Australia that doesn't include occupational justice somewhere. The extent to which it's a focus probably does vary. But I also think that occupational justice is included in the WFOT minimum standards, that it would need to be addressed in a curriculum that you would be putting forward for a WFOT accreditation. So it needs to be there, and I would say earlier on is better than later on. I've taught in different places in Australia and different parts of the world, and students, it's really hard for them when they've had very biomedically oriented staff in the first couple of years of their programs, and then in the later years they hear about occupational science and occupational justice, and they go, well, hang on a minute, why didn't we have that earlier? So I think it should be early on. I think that should be foundational concepts. And of course, if you're teaching about occupation, what is occupation? Why is it important? What's relationship to health and well-being? Then the absence of opportunities to engage in occupation is the occupational justices. So to me, the two go hand in glove. So Shobana, I think early on is important. I think teaching about occupational justice alongside teaching about occupation is a really natural fit. But more importantly, students being students, it's those lived examples. Get people in who to talk about what it's been like to, have had contracted polio as a child, and then the limitations they've had in their life trying to get a job. People from rural villages and the kind of poverty that's gone with that. I think the lived experiences are so powerful. I would get those people into the classrooms and get them to talk about their lives and then unpack it with the students.
Wonderful.
Start early.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gail.
Thank you. So Dr. White, we're at the top of the hour, but it's hard for me to let you go without asking this question. So if we have a few minutes, we'll do that. And then, if any of the participants have any final question or thoughts, we'll just do it. So please spare us a few minutes of your valuable time. So, in a lot of under-resourced, heavily populated countries, there is this survival of the fittest attitude that's very prevalent, right? So they don't really think about the needs of others. They don't really think that they are stepping into the they are depriving someone else an occupational opportunity, because that's the attitude of their life. So I've seen this in several countries that I've traveled to. So in your experience, how have you kind of addressed that or overcome that attitude? Because first, in order to teach the people, educate the people, we need to combat that attitude, in my view. So if you have any thoughts or insights on that.
It's a really good question. I've had many a kind of challenging moment over this, I have to say. So my overall now, having worked through, as you probably have, having seen terrible things and wanting to get angry with people, it's not really very constructive, to be fair. To take people with you on a journey of learning is more productive, more compassionate, and ultimately a better pathway to transformation. So, for example, the children that I saw tied up in this orphanage in a country I'm not going to name, initially I could have cracked heads against walls and said, what are you doing? This is not a way for children to be managed who had behavioral problems. But what we did over time was in talking about, again, what children need to do, and they need to be able to play. And we focused on, play actually as secondary and in a secondary way on self-care, and then demonstrated what could happen when you engaged a child with quite some destructive behaviors on meaningful play, and it was powerful. So demonstrate the power of meaningful occupation, which for children is play, is the way to go, I think, not just to talk it up, and certainly not to get angry with people. I mean, people, you're right, in very resource poor settings, people are kind of often doing their best, and sometimes types of care, and this is why I talked about institutions, is just keeping people alive. In some of the countries I've been to, people thought that was enough. They kept the kids alive. But okay, credit to you, but there's more you can do. And let's go on a journey of learning together about how that could happen and give people skills to do it, you know, so it's not just a theoretical notion. For me, of course, I've got the, you know, the challenge of being a white woman from a wealthy Western country. So that's really to not use that sense of privilege where I'm coming from, but actually to try and understand what's going on here. And when I actually got down to it, the staff in this particular place just felt overwhelmed with the children and had no idea how to cope with them. So tying them up to their cots and beds was the only way they knew how. So once we got through that and they could see how actually there was less work for them once the children were really engaged in play and setting up an environment that was conducive to play, everybody was happier. So I really learned from that. Don't judge. Take people with you, share knowledge, share skills, but always in doing what's right in that context too.
Thank you. All right. So given that we are now well past the time, anyone has an urging question that they want to ask Dr. Whiteford? Okay, hearing none, I would like to wrap up this session with our beloved Mahatma Gandhi's quote again: "Be the change you want to see in the world." So thank you, Dr. Whiteford. You honored us with your presence today. This is just a starting. We would like to collaborate with you in the future as well, and we would like to have you for another, presentation or chat in the future as well. For all the participants, this recording will be posted to our YouTube channel, and you can continue the conversation there. You can post your views, thoughts, and comment on it. Please follow us on all our social media pages, like we are on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and on YouTube as well. And very soon we'll be on Instagram. So we are trying to make us visible, thereby helping the community and the profession. So again, Dr. Whiteford, we cannot thank you enough. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us. Wherever you are, everyone, bye-bye. Have a good rest of the day. And let me go back to bed. It's like 3:30 to 4:30 a.m. that I attended this because I value the session so much. So if I'm babbling a little bit, then that's what it is. Like I'm just in the middle of the sleep.
You've done really well. And I wish everybody the best in your endeavors and very happy to keep the connection.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gail. Much appreciated. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.